Welcome, everybody. We're going to begin in just a few minutes. Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Colleen De Stovall. I'm the Director of Programs and Events for the Miami Center for Architecture and Design and the American Institute for Architects Miami. And we're so glad you're here tonight. And this is going to be a wonderful program. And I'd like to let you know a couple of things. First of all, this program is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel probably mid next week. So look for that. I'm also going to be sending out at the end of this event a short survey, and if you guys could help us out by just filling it out. We don't do anything with your information. It just helps us focus and improve our programming. Let us know what you like, don't like, and if you have any ideas for new programs, we would love to hear them. So right now, if you have questions, just put them in the chat. At the bottom, the Zoom chat, and we'll get to them towards the end of the book talk. And right now, I'd like to introduce the Miami Center for Architecture and Design's Executive Vice President, Cheryl Jacobs.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you. I know we have many people that have signed up for this, so we'll slowly be letting people in as the time goes on, but we didn't want to make those of you who are on time have to wait. So we're going to go ahead and start with our program. We're happy to see you all. Happy almost July 4th. So our speaker tonight needs no introduction, but I'm going to do a little one anyway. And before I forget, I don't want to wait till the end, if you are our call for entries and our AIA Miami Design Awards is happening now. So please go to the AIAmiami.org website and sign up if you have a project that you want to submit. Deadlines are coming up pretty soon. So let me say, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, FAIA and CNU, is the founding principal of DPZ Partners and the Malcolm Matheson Distinguished Professor of Architecture at the University of Miami, where she directs the Master in Urban Design program after 18 years as Dean of the School of Architecture. She is a founder of the Congress for New Urbanism, an organization established in 1993 to promote walkable, resilient urban design. She is co-author of Suburban Nation, The Rise of Sprawl and the Decline of the American Dream, and The New Civic Art, Elements of Town Planning. So with that, I'm going to, one very important thing. MCAD just awarded Liz with the Urban Warrior Lifetime Achievement Award. We were thrilled to award that at our event on May 20th. So congratulations, Liz, for that. And we're very proud of you. We're proud that you're a participant in AIA Miami and MCAD. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Q&A towards the end, and I'll do that with you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl and Colleen. And thank you to MCAD for allowing us or inviting us to show off this book. I'm just going to go immediately into screen share and first of all, explain that technically in all the Zoom teaching that I've been doing with slides, I've learned to keep the little slides on the left to stay out of trouble. So hopefully the images here are strong enough that they'll hold your attention even with that distraction.
Yeah, they look great.
But you know, I wasn't thinking about this, I must say, earlier, but as we were preparing to open this presentation, I realized that we should make note, or that I should make note of the catastrophe that has occurred in our region, which is so much related to all of our work, those of us who are in design and architecture. And I think every one of us is very much aware of our responsibilities as professionals and the kind of weight that is carried by people who produce buildings, take care of them, and so on. Because it's really always about people. You know, we work on the physical materials that surround people, whether it's buildings or cities. And sometimes it's easy to lose track of the fact that there are enormous issues of safety and well-being that we're responsible for. And so it almost seems a little bit out of place to be focusing on aesthetics as this presentation will. But I think those of you who are here probably agree with me that this is part of that responsibility, is to give people connections with culture, history, bring the past and the future together as people inhabit the built environment, and to give pleasure through the beauty of it. So without losing attention to the other responsibilities, I hope this may be inspiring. Some of these images may be inspiring to you, especially since many of them are from our region. So let me start with the names that are on this opening slide. You will see many beautiful photographs by Stephen Brooke, no surprise. Stephanie Solomon is the managing editor of The Classicist, which is a series, so you'll see this is number 17. And Shannon Tracy is a DPZ person, a person in my firm who has spent very much time and effort keeping all of this kind of materials organized. So you might recognize a building on the grounds of Vizcaya on the cover. So a little bit more about The Classicist as a publication. You'll see these are the immediate prior issues. This is a publication of the ICAA, begun in New York, but now with regional chapters, including one in Florida. And in recent years, The Classicist, besides exposing the work, the contemporary work of classical architects, started to focus on individual cities and regions. And so at some point about 2 years ago, I was asked if I would guest edit. There's always a guest editor. And I agreed to do one on the state of Florida. So this was put out, it came out at the end of the last year, which means that it's a COVID publication, which means that a lot of people couldn't complete their work. And so it's a little bit unusual because with fewer essays, it has more photographs. And what we've been hearing is the response has been that everybody loves having this many illustrations. No surprise, I suppose, from the world of design and architecture. So it does have some luscious images. But here is the organization of it. I'm just going to take you through it chronologically from beginning to end with a few slides with an overall history to start with that's very brief in my presenting it here, but you might be interested in reading that kind of assessment on your own. And then each one of these essays, I'll say a little bit about each of the writers, and we tried to cover the whole state. Some of the things that fell by the wayside were more of South Florida, and I think the key issue in my essay was acknowledging that there's still a lot of work to be done to document, research, document, and produce publications on our own history down here. It seems to have been done more completely in other places. So, of course, that history speaks to how we began in the whole state. I'm just going to show you a few of our South Florida buildings and the influences of them coming from other places. So our own City Hall in Coral Gables is a reference to an early 1800s building in Philadelphia called the Burse. I have Strickland was the name of the architect. I was about to say I forgot his name, who produced that building, and it inspired our architects, our local architects, to produce it as a city hall here. And so it's a kind of fitting opener to show the influence over time that buildings have. Now, one of the things that became evident in looking at the history, and I'm not a historian, I think everybody knows that. I'm a designer with a great love of history. But as I began to delve into how to show this kind of overview, I began to see that it really was going to be a conversation between the Orthodox classical of Greek and Roman revival and its evolution into the Mediterranean style. And so here you see, of course, 1902 in Palm Beach, Carrere and Hastings, who later designed the Public Library in New York, a fabulous building. They started out in St. Augustine, but always working with Flagler. And the Villa Vizcaya, a little bit later, a decade or more later, looking very similar in scale, but clearly something happened between these two buildings in terms of responding to perhaps fashion, perhaps the climate, the region. There are some things to talk about in terms of that. And so that my essay goes through and takes you to the more contemporary work, which is classically and traditionally inspired. And much like those first efforts, which building by building produced communities, and we're very much aware of producing new communities, we continue to do that in Florida. So what our beginnings are in a sense continuing. And so here you see Celebration and Seaside that are more recent versions of that. And then there are the kind of experiments or trying to make that history contemporary in ways that might be meaningful. The building we produce on the University of Miami campus for the School of Architecture by Leo Krier, who's been a great influence. And finally, one of the, I think, important aspects is the kind of continuing commitment that not only individual homeowners might have in patronizing, being the patrons for working in traditional mode, but that actually at a large scale development, this is continuing to happen particularly in Coral Gables, probably more than almost anywhere else in the United States. So if you think, yes, I know many people think these buildings are just too big. I heard about that while I was working on the code for the city of Coral Gables. But the fact of the matter is that they project the city's commitment to continuing the imagery with which it was begun by George Merrick and his architects at a scale that is really quite unusual in the US. The only other kind of commitment to this, to a large scale of traditional and classical building outside of residential architecture, is mostly happening on university campuses, the kind of beautiful campuses that have classical or even collegiate Gothic. We might develop some appreciation for the fact that we're carrying this on here. So one of the wonderful things about this, this publication is that in order to replace the missing articles, Michael Mesko and William Rutledge worked with me to produce a kind of portfolio of Florida architecture. Of course, most of it's less than 100 years old, or maybe just about 100 years old, reflecting our history. But it seemed worthwhile pulling it all into one place. And so, of course, you know these buildings from the city of Miami Beach, its original city hall, our courthouse, and the former home of the MCAD, which is the Keenel building, the old post office building, which it's actually hard to get out in front of it and see it that way. So that's a remarkable photo of it. And one of my favorites, of course, the old courthouse. This is the building that perhaps you might identify its location by saying it's behind Miami-Dade Community College, but it's a tour de force of classical language in porous coral rock stone, even the sculptures. And it was lovingly restored a number of years ago by the judges who insisted on its restoration. But it's really a very skillful building. At a smaller scale, in Coral Gables, the villages which were supposed to be 24, I think, exotic styles, and we ended up with 8 or so, showing the influence of tradition from many locations around the world, including, you see the little Dutch South African house, second from the top, Venetian pool, and quite interestingly, the church in front of the Congregational Church in front of the Biltmore Hotel, which is really about being influenced by Central America. It is a kind of simple shed structure with this incredibly luscious kind of icing on it, on its tower and its front door, which is very much like the Plateresque, the kind of neo-Baroque architecture of Central America. In Palm Beach, there has also, although less codified, been a long commitment to classical architecture, and starting with the Great Hotel, the Trumbauer Church that's actually in West Palm Beach, which is a Greek revival, a kind of very orthodox approach, the Mediterranean City Hall, the Meisner buildings, and John Volk on the lower right-hand corner is someone who carried on, an architect who carried on well into mid-century and beyond, both in Palm Beach and Vero Beach, classical organization and proportions of buildings. Now, on the other coast, this is one of my favorites, the St. Petersburg post office, which I didn't know about at all, but learned a little bit more as I worked on these photos, was the initiative of a postmaster who apparently for many, many years argued with his bosses in Washington about building a building where the post boxes would be outdoors, facing out. And that's what those dark, on the right-hand side, what might look like dark doors are in fact the post boxes that you can walk right up to in the arcade and put a key into and pick up your mail. And then of course, beautifully decorated according to regional imagery. This is really a remarkable building that I think very few of us probably knew existed. So there's many more photographs in that portfolio. And then there are a series of articles by historians. So starting at the north, we thought it was important to show St. Augustine in its classical mode. And this was the early work of Carrere and Hastings, working with Flagler. An incredible series of buildings that are now, I think, as you know, a college, an academic institution, but started out being resort hotels. And if you look closely at these, and if you've never seen them, here you might notice that they're made of board form concrete with terracotta inserts and trimmings. And just incredibly artfully designed in detail, including interiors, elaborate interiors, gold leaf in the ceilings, mosaic, marble mosaics on the floors, and a series of other buildings working in the same themes. Churches, there's several of these. The Leitner Museum, which was also a hotel building. Such an interesting mix of both the contemporary, what was at the time experimenting with technology. If you think about poured concrete, it was really just beginning. And the idea that you might mix it up with terracotta is probably not everybody's first idea. One thing to be said about those, Bernard Maybeck, who later moved to California and did a series of wonderful buildings there, was one of the people working on this. So clearly his creativity played a role in it. Bruce Stevenson, many of you know, professor at Rollins, of course, wrote about Rollins as a kind of commitment of community building in Central Florida, which was very much aware that it was part of what was known as the American Renaissance when it was starting. And again, Kienel and Elliott, that's a partnership of names of two architects who deserve certainly research and a publication, which is yet to be done. And Ralph Adams Cram, who was well known for his work in other parts of the United States. And our own Marise Chael and her firm producing more recent buildings in support of the history of that campus. Wayne Wood, who declares he's not a historian, but very much committed to the Jacksonville Historical Society, produced a lovely article on Clouthier, who came to Jacksonville after the fire at the turn of the century and saw through a transition from classical architecture to modernism that we can trace in our own region as well. And one of the things that you will see in Clouthier's work is that the upper parts of the building are bronze, parts of this building and the prior one, largely probably in response to um, the memory of that fire. And slowly the work evolved. It took on the influences of Frank Lloyd Wright, a kind of exploration of bringing Frank Lloyd Wright to Florida. And in a wonderful place that I only recently went to for the first time, Palatka, in the heart of the state, this Art Deco gem, which reflects some of the change, evolution that occurred in South Florida when many of our architects moved from their classical and Mediterranean mode into Art Deco. And that also would be another topic for research and publication. Beth Dunlap, who has a lovely, actually very large book about Addison Meisner with Steve Brooks photographs, also produced an article for us speaking about Meisner's work, some of its influences, and she has reminded me that I should tell you that she has a book about the buildings that have been disappearing. This was one of her early books. But clearly, Meisner's work was influential throughout the state. And although we're not, I don't know enough about this to tell you whether he was really the first person or whether just the greatest impetus of bringing this style to South Florida, but it certainly was part of something that was going on throughout the country. And it has a lot to do with the fact that architects at the beginning of the 20th century were traveling to Europe in a way that they hadn't before. And the first formal education for architects was the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And a number of American architects were educated there, but many others really benefited from the kinds of publications that were beginning to come out, these very big supersized portfolios of those travel photographs. Many of them are here in our library at the University of Miami. And you will find, for instance, specific pieces of buildings, not necessarily Meisner's, diverging a little bit here, but of many of the villages in Coral Gables that you can find a black and white photograph, which was being emulated in those houses. Meisner was a tour de force of urban architecture, of putting series of buildings together in such a way that it might look that they went up over time or by different hands. This, of course, is Worth Avenue, which is one of the most beautiful streets in our region. And that 4- or 5-story tower was his own residence. Of course, the large houses, which are further explorations of the style. Having done an exhibit with many years ago with Tina Cahal at the museums in Palm Beach, one of the things we discovered about these sprawling houses was that they were really set up for parties and guests, and that you always had a kind of long walk between the living room and the dining room. So there was clearly this kind of trajectory of drinks in the living room, and then with some people, and then as you walked to the dining room, perhaps you walked with somebody else, and then you were seated with someone else in the dining room. And it was a kind of idea about moving people through space, which then I tried to apply, I'll admit, recently to the president's house for the University of Miami. But these are spectacular efforts. They're really worthy of being civic buildings, and reflecting an eclectic background of the Mediterranean, not just the western side of it or the central part of it, but also its eastern sides. Andres Duani put together a few pages on the work of one of our contemporaries, no longer alive, but Charles Barrett, some of you knew both as a teacher and as someone that you worked with. And we have a wonderful collection of his drawings, which his family gathered upon his death. He was very important, I think, to opening the door for many people through his graphic explorations and opening the door for his generation. He was a little bit younger than I am. And the Institute for Classical Architecture and Art, in fact, was started by his contemporaries. And so he was learning on the fly. He taught himself. He's a Yale grad, and he said, nobody ever taught me any of this. He had to go out and look for it himself, and incredibly skilled at every scale. These are his drawings working at an urban scale, as well as at the individual scale of building. And that small gatehouse on the right was for Johnson and Wales University in Providence, Rhode Island, a DPZ plan, and it was built. So although he had to be self-taught, and in fact, many of us who are engaged in this work would say the same thing. There is now a rising amount of educational opportunities for studying traditional and classical architecture of not only the American prototypes, but European and other cultures. I have students from China who bring me publications of old books being republished there. And there are a number of universities. So part of this volume shows you university work, really outstanding efforts by students taught by incredible teachers. This is a project that was developed at Notre Dame. Here I have to be looking at the book while I'm showing you through these. On the left, on the right, that's the University of Miami. On the left, that is the Savannah College of Art and Design. And there are any number of others, Judson University, the Kingston School of Art in London. Catholic University of America has committed, or has made a recent commitment, including hiring Mark Ferguson as dean. Andrews University, Yale has one classical studio option for students. Benedictine College in Kansas. And so INTBAU, the International Network of Traditional Building, Architecture and Urbanism, has a summer school in Europe that students go to. And of course, the ICAA as well has special courses that can be taken in various parts of the country. And then finally, these issues of the classicist end with a professional portfolio. I should say they end with, I'm not showing you any of the advertisements, but those are actually worth looking at, because I've always thought that, you look at Architectural Record or any of the architecture magazines, and you say, how can they do such terrible advertisements for their products? Can they not somehow imagine that the advertisements should reflect the quality of the building that they're trying to show? And the Classicist actually does. The sponsors who are at the back of it have some very beautiful images of their products and work. So here are a series of local projects. We snuck one in, a few in Santo Domingo, although in the Caribbean, although we were admonished to stay only in Florida. But this is the work of architects. This is a house by Ernesto Buch, which is entirely made of cut stone. He's trained the stone layers, the stonemasons in his part of Santo Domingo to do these beautiful buildings. And he's also designed a small workers' village with a lovely chapel. Gil Schaefer, of course, a New York architect working further south, as many do, in a more vernacular mode. And then the kind of advancements or explorations of the language, such as Currywurst in Alice Beach. You'll see another similar one, or historical concepts based in Atlanta who do beautiful work all over the South. It was nice to be able to show one of their projects because it's here in Florida. Merrill Pastor and Colgan, located in Vero Beach, but here likewise working in the Panhandle. And so, you know, I think what's interesting is that we actually do have quite a collection of buildings that are more than large houses, which is one of the complaints that many people often make about the ICAA. You know, we're just doing big houses for patrons, but there's some serious work going on that's both engages housing as well as civic buildings. Duncan Stroik, of course, is a premier religious architecture architect located in South Bend. Our own Coral Gables Museum edition. So that's the end of the slides. I leave you with this short statement that I only recently found, which explains very well one of the reasons that I have enjoyed so much, I think, working with tradition, both in architecture and urbanism, is that it enables this kind of connection over time, thinking that we can be speaking with our predecessors, that we can be grateful for their work and not just be thinking about superseding it all the time. And that in fact, our work might be bridging into the future. Thank you.
Liz, thank you so much. Those buildings are just so gorgeous. It's hard to think about so many that we've lost, and so wonderful to see so many that we still have.
Yeah.
And you know, Florida has, you know, if it was built before 10 years ago, right? It goes sometimes. So it's wonderful to see so much that has been saved, and then so much that looks to the past for the current and the future. I don't think we have any questions because it's just, I think everybody is just so soaking in all the beauty. I wanted to let everyone know that you can purchase this book at Books and Books. Go there first, but it is also online at Amazon. And I tell you, I'm going to go get it because it just looks gorgeous. So
Yeah, well,
thank you.
You know, it's no surprise that there are not questions when you look at these beautiful things. And I wish you all might enjoy more images than I didn't want to overdo it. this evening, but I do see that we have a number of people with us who themselves have engaged in this kind of work. I could call out
Sure.
perhaps Say, and if you haven't walked away, maybe you could say something about your work working with Rollins.
Well, when Victor and I first went to Rollins, it just felt like how amazing is this place. It felt like a garden, far, far away, from everyday life. And it's just a spectacular place. And I was just so taken by the quality of good work of buildings that were hardly 100 years old. And I think it stands to as an inspiration for what we could still achieve.
Absolutely.
So Say, you were asked to do the gate. This is both the gate and the admissions building, right?
Yes, they were built at the same time. Well, let me see. I've been asked to share the video. Can you? Anyway, yes, they were built at the same time.
Did you want to share? Shall I stop sharing?
No. No, it's fine. They were done at the same time, and Rollins was very, very process oriented. So much so that they built a full size model of the gateway, prior to construction, just because they wanted to be sure that the scale of the monument, and as a matter of fact, there are pairs of gates, that they were the right scale, the right height. There were many debates, and it's so wonderful that they hired someone with a stage set that they had on campus, and they actually brought the model on the site overnight, and people were wondering how did they manage to do something so quickly. But I mean, it was just a scale of care exemplified by the gateway that was just so impressive, and it was actually a community effort. I mean, there's so, and we had done various designs because prior they had hired several other architects who all struck out. And one of the things, interestingly, Victor Dover said, we just need to stay in the game. We need to do several designs so that they could debate and be part of the process. So it was just wonderful to see how that evolved.
Thank you for that. Yeah, well, and you mentioned something that we don't see so much down here, which are the full-scale mock-ups for construction. Right. We start building and then we find out what the problems are. But that's a kind of norm in other parts of the country. So, I think in some ways, that's why the Mediterranean, if we were to say that there was a kind of competition. Let me go back to the beginnings, if I may.
While you're doing that, Liz, I in the chat, Victor, whose name, the aforementioned Victor Dover, is thanking you for your beautiful talk.
Thank you. So, one of the questions might be why did it move from the classical of the late 19th century or turn of the century to the Mediterranean? And part of the classical beginnings, both in Palm Beach and in Jacksonville, with the Clouthier buildings, was in fact the influence of the Chicago World's Fair. And so a couple of the essays point to that because of course Chicago is the prior issue or the prior volume of the Classicist. And that the World's Fair had an enormous effect or influence throughout the country. But I think one of the things that the architects began to see is that it's not very forgiving. It's really requires a certain discipline, and also the craftsmanship. How are you going to make columns with emphasis? You know, in a part of the world which never had great detailing from beginning to now, it's better, I presume. But the Mediterranean is very forgiving, both usually in its massing, as you can see in the work of Meisner. So you still see the kind of classical organization in Vizcaya, but it's already working with a kind of a looser vocabulary of the language of the embellishments isn't quite as demanding. And so then when you go to, let's say if we can find the work of Meisner, you begin to see that, you know, there's this kind of picturesque approach to putting many elements together. Might be considered more forgiving or easier to deal with, especially under the speed of building that was occurring down here. If you've read Arva Parks's book about Coral Gables, about George Merrick, it's worth reading the incredible amount of property that was being sold and buildings built before the hurricane that brought everything to a halt. And so it's clear that it was, this was about expediting the community building. And it's very different than the California Mediterranean or Spanish style. There's two different influences. The California buildings are much more scenographic and kind of composed on surfaces, and these are made of volumes, you know, kind of standalone volumes. This building could be 3 or 4 buildings standing separately. You know, that's a kind of more direct line from the Mediterranean.
Yeah. So Liz, there is a question from Ed Yarka. Is there a reason Fisher Island is never considered in master planning or Mediterranean revival architecture?
You know, that's an interesting question because there is a lot of Mediterranean in South Florida that we, let's say, don't get excited about. That we don't find as inspiring as the earlier buildings. And I think that has to do with the skill of the composition and the fact that there is, although it's forgiving, there can be different degrees of quality in the design, in the compositions that we have to acknowledge. And some of it has to do with the ability to work with scale. You know, so these are very long buildings, not very tall, but there's an ability to make it appear to be made of smaller pieces, which is important. And the larger buildings are more difficult to do that with. You know, I don't have a photo of the Biltmore Hotel, but that's a real lesson in a very large building, which appears to be a tower. I mean, this would require a drawing. If I were teaching, I would be drawing on the screen to show you that it's really a big box with a little blip on top. And then it has been detailed in such a way that the tower is extruded only slightly, comes completely to the ground or to the first floor. and therefore gives the building a kind of vertical proportion, which is further magnified by the fact that the wings are given all sorts of horizontal expression to make them seem lower and longer. And so the kind of understanding of proportion and perception of massing is a skill which I think some of the in-between years of Mediterranean architecture didn't quite understand. So I'm probably responding to a question from somebody who lives on Fisher Island. And I don't mean to be, and I'm in no way negative about your buildings. I'm just saying that it's a challenge.
Well, listen, this has been wonderful. I want to thank you for your time, your expertise. I love the way that you talk about architecture, because so often, you know, I've worked with architects for a really long time, but so often when architects discuss architecture, it's done in such a way that if you're not an architect, you don't get it. And you always have this wonderful way of talking about it and discussing it so that you're not dumbing it down, but you're explaining it in a way that really opens your eyes to what you're talking about. So I want to thank you and thank everybody who has dialed in tonight. And we have some more from your out of town fans. Thank you.
I'm just looking over at the chat. So, you know, I'll point out to you that the next, I don't know who the guest editor of the next one is, but the topic is the Mid-Atlantic. So
okay.
Lots of things to enjoy up there. And I think if you go back and look at any of the others, you'll enjoy having them.
Terrific. And Ed says, nope, he's an architect, so he can't afford to live on Fisher Island. So thank you again, Liz. Thanks to everybody. And your husband's book talk is coming up soon.
That's right.
And Colleen, are you still on? I don't have the date in front of me, but
I believe it's the 9th.
July 9th.
Okay, yes,
The 9th
yes,
of
July 9th. So hopefully we'll see you all back, and we'll see you back again for your next book, Liz, because I'm sure there'll be another one before too long.
No, this was heavy lifting. You won't see me for a while. Anyway, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your questions. Marise, thank you for joining in. And
yeah,
Colleen and Cheryl, thank you for this evening.
of course.
Thanks
Take care,
everyone for
everyone.
joining us, and look for in an email, look for a survey that I'm going to send. Please fill it out. It would be helpful. And I'll also include the link to the recording of this program. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.